The first on my immediate right is Rafal Rohozinski, which he says is the only Polish name which is phonetic. He's the CEO and founder of the Secdev group, which provides intelligence and tool sets and so on in this area. He's been in this area for 20 years, involving work in 37 countries. He's one of Canada's thought leaders. He's published a lot in the area. And then next to him is Dr. Rex Hughes, who's a visiting fellow in Cambridge University in England and at the University of Toronto. He's been, in the last few years, a cyber defense advisor to NATO, and he's also advised various companies as well as published a great deal. I'm afraid technologically, I'm about as near illiterate as you could be, and I say my heritage is Jurassic Park. So I just have a lot to learn, and I hope there are some others here who desire as much to learn as I do. So first of all, it's over to you, Rafal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Will we have the slides up? Perfect. Good afternoon. It doesn't take much than scanning the headlines of most newspapers or a few minutes looking across the television to see how cyberspace is impacting our modern-day life. In the Middle East, cell phones, Twitter, and Facebook have joined the lexicon of revolution as opposition movements leverage these tools and in some cases overwhelm the capabilities of regimes and ossified state security forces. Within the group of 20 countries, the world's leading economies, every week brings revelations of governments, corporations, and individuals being compromised, leading to the loss of confidential documents, private information, and economic costs as computer systems are targeted systematically by criminals, cyber spies, and self-appointed vigilantes like the hacking group Anonymous. According to reliable statistics, the threat of malignant software, that is, software which is deliberately written to exploit or attack your systems, has been growing at a rate of approximately 100% every year since 2003. According to Symantec, one of the leading threat intelligence firms in this area, up to 65% of all global internet users have at one time or another fallen victim to a form of cybercrime. These attacks now target everything from banks to critical infrastructure to Sony's online gaming network. The systematic way in which EU, North American, banking and governmental systems have been breached suggests that in the ocean of criminality, a hidden, covert, and largely undeclared warfighting capability has also emerged outside of the realm of international law. The disruption and destruction that these capabilities threaten are seen as equivalent to weapons of mass destruction, leading some states, such as Russia, to cast ominous warnings linking cyber attack to a nuclear response. Addressing the challenge that cyberspace represents is fraught with difficulties, as each of these weekly events and phenomena throws up a myriad of policy, technical, and legal work that requires months, if not years, to establish. And yet the pace of events appears relentless, cascading, and continuous, threatening to overwhelm and in many cases overtake policymakers at the national and international level. There's also a more fundamental challenge. Our current government and business leadership has grown up to see cyberspace as inevitable, constant, and always there. It's almost inconceivable to go back to a world before fiber optics, satellite connections, and cheap and always available 24/7 communications. We have re-engineered our business processes, governance, and finance, and even our personal lives around the existence of these capabilities. Likewise, governments north and south have banked on the information revolution. Billions have been spent on bringing IT to the masses. Even the most disadvantaged areas and populations, recognizing that knowledge is an essential component of development. In short, we've created an interdependent and highly complex global domain without really being cognizant of what we were doing, nor of its consequences. And that's the point. Cyberspace is as much social as it is technological. Its technical characteristics and parameters may have been designed by engineers, but how it is being used and how it is being applied now resembles a living, breathing socio-technical environment whose technical characteristics are as much subject to social and political pressures as they are the wishes of engineers, governments, and policymakers. As we now turn our attention to creating a framework for governing this global domain, reasserting state interests, defining technical standards, and rules and regulations, we face a twofold challenge. First is that as we struggle with the words and basic definitions and concepts, the rules are already being written out there in the wild by actors who have colonized and appropriated this domain as their own. Secondly, in our quest to impose order over what appears to be chaos, we risk transforming and changing cyberspace, potentially with negative, if not catastrophic consequences for governments, citizens, and for global business. In our own research, which encompasses several large-scale efforts jointly with the University of Cambridge, Toronto, and Harvard, we have sought to take a very hard-edged, evidence-based approach to outlining and defining the major trends shaping cyberspace and their potential consequences. And these can be summarized in 5 key drivers: the shifting demographics of cyberspace, the globalization of cybercrime, cyber espionage and the militarization of cyberspace, and the emergence of cyberspace as a political domain. The first of these, demographics, is key. At present, the US is less than 13% of the global internet population. Combined, the US and Europe percentage is just under 40%. The tectonic plates of cyberspace are shifting, as its center of gravity will soon be in the south and in the east. If cyberspace as we know it today is largely a product of Silicon Valley and the drive, entrepreneurship, ethos, and norms inherent to a very specific engineering culture, we have to ask ourselves, what will be the future of cyberspace when the center of gravity for innovation shifts to the south and to the east? The answer may not be what we expect. This is the new face of global digital natives. Poor, developing countries, failed and fragile states are among the fastest growing segments, many among the top 17. These countries all have a median age of approximately 18, significant youth bulges. They are heavily indebted, but cyberspace is expanding fast in these countries, in the several tens of thousands of percentages per year. In Nigeria, penetration rates are over 30%, and in crisis countries like Pakistan already have a significant and growing online population. These new natives, digital natives, are already changing the very culture of cyberspace. For them, cyberspace was never free, never really just fun, but it does represent a way of accessing rights, resources, and the global market in a way that simply doesn't exist in real life. This will have significant implications for the future of cyberspace, and already has, as I'll describe shortly. In some ways, the globalization of cybercrime is the most important and perhaps significant social phenomenon which is yet poorly understood. The demographic shift in cyberspace has effectively created the means for millions of individuals to seek what you may call euphemistically personal poverty alleviation. Bluntly put, if you want to understand the problem of global cybercrime, you have to understand that it's a lot less risky to commit a victimless crime by defrauding a bank, hacking into its clients' accounts in Dusseldorf and Basel, than it is to fight over a fistful of rubles in the decaying alleyways and tenements of Ekaterinburg. This growing constituency of the empowered but disenfranchised is perhaps one of the greatest agents of change in cyberspace. In many ways, this pattern would be familiar to development economists who track the way that information processing technologies act as drivers of change for national development. The difference between how that's occurred in the last 40 years, for example, in accounting for the difference in economic development between Ghana and South Korea, is that networks have become global. Empowerment occurs at the individual level and not just at the nation state. It's the youth, the clever transnational gangs that form the newly empowered cyber underclass, who by sheer innovation and fearlessness are redefining cyberspace and forcing us to confront important constitutive questions. Last year, our group worked with the largest Canadian telecommunications provider, Bell Canada, to try to quantify the percentage of traffic on Canadian networks that could be attributed to cybercrime. We really wanted to know what it looked like. The reason we worked with Bell Canada is that we wanted to get that top-level aggregate view. Bell Canada is unique in that it carries approximately 95% of what can be considered Canadian cyberspace, and as a result can provide a very complete picture. What we found was shocking, but perhaps not surprising. In total, we examined over 830 petabytes of data, and were able to disaggregate this data by categories. This data represents 90% of all government traffic and critical infrastructure, 80% of all enterprises, and approximately 50% of the consumer space. We found that Canadians send over 45 billion emails per month, operating over 50 million IP addresses and making over 27 million connections, and that the network carried approximately $174 billion per day in financial transactions. But what we found next was more disturbing. Bell Canada's network also carries over 53 gigabytes per second of bad traffic. That is to say, traffic associated with botnets, malware, and other such uses. That includes 80,000 zero-day exploits per day, over 1.5 million compromised computers at any given time, and out of 45 billion emails sent per month, 44 billion are spam or otherwise loaded with a malware payload. Most disturbingly, particularly for those who depend on Bell Canada for financial services, is that out of 174 billion transiting Canadian networks, $100 billion could be considered revenue at risk. The compelling point arising out of this study was to quantify the scale and scope of colonization of Canadian cyberspace by criminal actors. This mass is significant not just for the economic losses and insecurity it creates, but also the basis it creates for other, more serious national security considerations, which are equally shaping and driving our current approach to cybersecurity. Of these, the most contentious issue is that of cyber espionage. In the past 2 years, there have been increasing revelations of high-level penetrations against government departments, ministries of defense, and economic interests across the G8 and in particular the US. What these penetrations share in common is that their basic architecture, approaches are largely indistinguishable from techniques and tradecraft used by cybercrime, though their intent and targets are obviously quite different. Our group was involved in investigating 2 cases which we published as public cases and which I can talk about here. The GhostNet investigation was one which began by looking at alleged penetrations of computer systems operated by the government of Tibet in exile and the Dalai Lama. Eventually, we uncovered a network of compromised computers across 103 countries, focused mostly on ministries of foreign affairs, embassies, and other political targets. The victim list included everything from the Russian embassy in Beijing, the Foreign Ministry of Iran, the Laotian Prime Minister's office, and the Taiwan Trade Commission, and embassies of India around the world. The second investigation, which we called Shadows in the Cloud, was related to GhostNet in that the initial infection was also found on the same computer systems as those that we investigated during GhostNet. But that network was much more focused, ultimately comprising only 12 highly placed computers, focused mostly and solely on Indian foreign and defense interests. In the case of GhostNet, we were able to track the attackers' command and control servers as well as their communication channels in real time. We were able to observe the attacker as he connected to the victim systems using a DSL line and local telephone number on Hainan Island in the People's Republic of China. In the case of Shadows in the Cloud, we were able to identify and capture the documents as they were being taken by the attacker from the infected computer systems. In total, we were able to recover over 700 documents, most of which were clearly marked secret and top secret, and which focused on specific security and intelligence information. Both attacks used the same penetration techniques which they shared in common with typical cybercrime. They established a specific individual in order to establish a bridgehead into a network of trust. They attempted to assert real-time and persistent control over the affected systems. And the material that they sought to find was highly specific. In this example, which I'm showing on screen, shows you a visa application made by a Canadian in the Indian embassy in Kabul, which was exfiltrated from that system. In both investigations, we were able to positively identify the attacker's point of origin, as well as the attackers themselves. Although I can't discuss the specific methods or techniques one of the things that this experience convinced us of is that the attribution question is more of a political and legal problem than it is one of practicality. In our case, we're using a system called Palantir. We were able to rapidly identify the specific command and control networks that were being used and establish their architecture across channels. Then we waited for the attackers to make a mistake. In the case of Shadows in the Cloud, the attacker happened to use the same email for one more purpose, including an apartment rental in Chengdu. Further work allowed us to track back the originating IP address used by the attacker to the University of Electronic Science and Technology in Chengdu, and to identify this individual as a researcher at the university and a well-known member of the criminal hacker underground in China. I'd stress that in neither case did we allege or make any connection to the government of China, although circumstantial evidence, including the selection of the targets and the nature of the material being taken, suggests that the attacker had a very specific intent. The experience of these investigations let us make several observations about the phenomenon of cyber espionage and how it impacts on interstate relations, both on the government level and also on the commercial sector. These can be summarized in 4 points. First is that cyberspace has revolutionized intelligence. Whereas 20 years ago, signals intelligence was focused on building global collection platforms, the emergence of a seamless global network has made it possible to build collection devices that are relatively autonomous and inexpensive. The cost of a collection has effectively fallen to zero and can be outsourced to numerous actors, including cyber criminals. This has meant that not only is it cheaper to launch more collection platforms, but it's also possible for organizations other than states to essentially build their own signals intelligence capability. A second characteristic is what we call the attack of the ants. Because the cost of deployment is near zero, these collection platforms can be launched numerous times against the same target. It's instructive that in both the GhostNet and Shadows investigation were found on the same computer system, even though they represented separate and distinct collection platforms. The scale is significant. Based on our work with Bell Canada, we can confidently estimate that between 5 and 12% of all computers on Canadian networks are zombies, that is, connected in one form or another to a criminal botnet. The reason this happened is based upon another statistic that we generated, and that is, on average, Canadian networks are subject to 80,000 zero-day attacks per day. The sheer volume means the scale of vulnerability and our current approaches to security, which are still very much built around a Maginot Line mentality of keeping an attacker out of the network, are no longer applicable. And what's needed is new approaches that emphasize behavioral security, assuming that there's always going to be an attacker within your perimeter and basing your defense upon rapid detection and management of threats. A third characteristic is the difficulty faced in trying to pursue these cases through the existing international legal channels, given that attackers are clever enough to use jurisdiction as a way to avoid prosecution. Some issues may be obvious, but others less so. At the moment, most police forces are at a severe disadvantage. The situation is similar to that which occurred in the 1920s in the US during the time of alcohol prohibition, when organized gangs were simply better armed, better networked, and had better mobility than the police forces trying to combat them. A final takeaway from these investigations was the degree to which security of data could no longer be restricted to that which can be secured on your own network. In the case of Shadows in the Cloud, it was Canadian confidential information consisting of a visa application that was compromised on an Indian system. Since there are few Canadian tourist groups in Afghanistan at this time, we can confidently establish that the operational security for Canadian ISAF personnel in Afghanistan was compromised as a result of a breach occurring on an Indian system. The effects of networked insecurity can be widespread, and I'll leave it to your imagination what effect this kind of insecurity would have on the highly wired and connected global financial community. Cybercrime and cyber espionage are also having a significant way we're having to rethink warfighting in the context of cyberspace. For the most part, perceived vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure, hackers, are responsible for a spiraling arms race in cyberspace. In part, it's driven by fear. In part, it's driven by a recognition of the strategic significance of the space, given its role as the heartland of national and global economic systems. Much like the bomber gap of the 1950s or the missile gap of the 1960s, it spurred a business which is estimated to be worth between $50 and $90 billion, and a spiraling arms race not seen since the Cold War as countries race to build operational capabilities against the theoretical probability or possibility of cyberwar. In some cases, the fears are justified. The criticality of cyberspace to economic systems, as well as to the operational requirements of modern militaries. Just think GPS, supply chains, as well as more traditional command and control ISR networks. And there's little doubt while countries are pursuing these capabilities. But here, as in most things, the future will rarely conform to our expectations. Generals tend to plan wars based on experiences of those gone by, while we may be planning and conceptualizing cyberspace operations to fit existing laws of armed conflict and our own operational concepts in practice. The Russia-Georgia war demonstrated the efficiency and effectiveness of using hackers as an undeclared sixth column. Accepting the disruptive and orthogonal ways in which war will evolve is a major challenge for strategic leadership, and warfighters east and west addressing the consequences of unrestricted warfare in cyberspace, or rather warfare without rules of war, is something which requires a great deal of consideration by the strategic leadership of all countries. There's also a greater challenge in initiating a discussion among the cyber powers around a treaty of cyberspace or a process of cyber arms control to prevent the spiraling arms race from subverting the very benefits that cyberspace represents to global economic prosperity and growth. But cybercrime, espionage, and warfighting are not the only ways in which networks are affecting societies. Cyberspace is also transforming politics. As more of us globally go online, so too is politics. Early views of cyberspace saw it as routing around institutional barriers. Some argued a strong correlation between these technologies and positive social change, dubbing them liberation technologies and linking them to positive political changes which include the color revolutions in the CIS and now the Arab Spring. Arguments exist on both sides as to whether there's such a thing as a Twitter revolution, or whether, just like the invention of print, magazines brought politics to the masses, cyberspace is bringing politics to the globalized masses, allowing them to group and create movements and to consolidate and coordinate it faster than in previous times. The point, perhaps not lost on many states, is that cyberspace has become a much more significant domain for domestic political competition and will be so in the future. Although only a third of humanity is online currently, over 80% of those under 35 in cyberspace are connected to social network sites and media of one kind or another. It's also clear that states have not sat by idly and ceded the social and political space to these networked movements. In fact, their moves to regulate and contain cyberspace within national boundaries have been aggressive and increasing. A few days ago, for example, China announced plans to consolidate several regulatory bodies into a new super-converged state internet information office. If you live in the Middle East, this is what you're more likely to see when trying to access popular news or blog sites. Building borders and putting in place controls has become the norm rather than the exception. In fact, when examined statistically, out of the approximately 2 billion people currently connected to the internet, almost half live under one form of restriction or another. So where are these trends leading? Without dwelling on it, if the decade of the 1990s and the 2000s was about the expansion of global cyberspace as a driver for economic change, this present decade is about securing cyberspace from negative and unpredictable phenomenon which can affect national security as well as state stability. The re-sovereignization of cyberspace has begun, and it is a path with many dangers. Introducing rules to control users and usage risks undoing many of the positive benefits of networking and risks the integrity of cyberspace itself as it becomes more cantonized and controlled along linguistic, national, and political lines. Proposals such as those introducing national kill switches may bring other, more catastrophic events to the global trade system, and in particular global finance, which depends on the 24/7 availability of them. Cyberspace, as we know it today, is a unique man-made domain that emerged largely without the involvement of nation-states. It exists as a de facto common area, as if borders and state sovereignty didn't matter. But they do. The danger is as we seek to develop rules that make this space more predictable, we risk diminishing cyberspace or even disrupting and destroying it in the way that it's emerged over the last 20 years. As we move towards regulated cyberspace, transparency and accountability are key, especially as public institutions are ill-prepared and many of the factors and issues shaping cyberspace, global governance, are complex and as a result difficult for politicians to grasp. The slope between the road to hell and good intentions is a slippery one indeed. Countering terrorism becomes silencing legitimate opposition. Filtering inappropriate content suddenly becomes the basis for faith-based filtering, which declares as culturally unacceptable anything that challenges the social status quo. In Saudi Arabia, it is haram, unacceptable, for a woman to send a smiley by SMS on her cell phone, and that constitutes revealing her face. I won't even try to explain what led Bell Canada's marketing department to equate basic female anatomy as inappropriate content from which children should be shielded. The issues involved are mind-bogglingly complex, and yet, as we stand on the precipice of deciding whether the future of cyberspace will be one that continues to evolve into a global commons, a commonwealth that empowers us all by making possible the free flow of knowledge, ideas, and capital, or whether it's parceled up, gated, and otherwise turned into the private gardens by a confluence of economic and political interests. In 1937, H.G. Wells prophetically wrote, "The whole human memory can be and probably in short time will be made accessible to every individual. It need not be concentrated in any one single place. It need not be vulnerable as a human head or human heart is vulnerable. It can be reproduced directly and fully in Peru, China, Iceland, and Central Africa, or wherever else seems to afford an insurance against danger and interruption. It can at once have the concentration of a craniate animal and the diffused vitality of an amoeba." Cyberspace has indeed emerged as H.G. Wells' world brain, but it is an immature and complex brain, similar to that of an adolescent making the difficult transition into its teenage years. There's an old saying that goes, "It takes a village to raise a child." Thus, in our view, the future of cyberspace should be decided through a multi-stakeholder process, as a collective approach is a better guarantee to ensuring resilience and guarding against bad mistakes than if those functions are left to a few to decide behind closed doors. I thank you for your attention, and I'd like to turn over the microphone to my colleague Rex Hughes, who also works with us in our broad collaborative projects, to say a few words about how the response to these challenges is being formed in the international fora. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafal. And so, where is all of this heading, and what does a contested cyberspace mean for your business, ministry, school, or NGO? As Rafal eloquently noted, cyberspace is a contested space, which is highly vulnerable to overreaction by government and underperformance by business. If you're following the news last week, you may have indeed read about the high-profile anonymous attack on electronics giant Sony and its global PlayStation network. Was that attack a demonstration of engineering brilliance and technical prowess on the part of Anonymous? Or was it an example of an internal business policy failure that will forever reshape the industry? Evidence disclosed publicly thus far points to a business process failure, and as Jeff Moss explained during the last work session, it was mainly a failure in contingency planning, not having the ability to provide immediate backup. And if you compare that with the attack on Amazon.com last month, they were able in a matter of hours to restore their entire S3 network. Sony may have made a number of tactical errors, firstly not encrypting their customers' sensitive data, and again, the backup. And for a small business of 100 or so employees, this type of error could probably be managed rather easily, but for a Fortune 100 company, a potential public relations disaster. Not to mention losing customer trust. But so what are the practical steps for your organization to consider? Well, at the macro level, what should the global commons ultimately look like, and whose principles, norms, and values will prevail. Cyberspace has been a private space for most of its life, but governments are beginning to take active measures to defend its sovereignty. We have already seen the societal impact of social networking in the Middle East when Tunisia, Egypt shut down their internet and national backbones. But what happens if a developed economy such as Switzerland attempts to shut down its sovereign cyberspace during a national emergency? And would the impact what would the impact be on your national information society and that of wider Europe? Not to mention trading partners. Now, China last week announced the creation of a new super converged internet regulatory body. And it's worth considering what impact this body will have on Chinese cyber leadership globally, and how will foreign firms take to its future mandates, and what will its authority impact Chinese relations with other international fora engaged in internet governance and human rights. The internet has come a long way since its early ARPANET days. The internet protocol TCP/IP is approaching its 5th decade of use, and the .com commercial internet is nearing 20 years of deployment. But how will conflicting values in cyberspace shape the future of the internet? There are a number of international organizations and corporations engaged in the current debate over the future of cyberspace: the United Nations, European Union, NATO, OECD, APEC, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Mercosur in the South. Some states are attempting to exert global leadership. In February, British Foreign Secretary William Hague at the Munich Security Conference proposed a roadmap towards international treaty to regulate cyber warfare. And I was privileged to participate in the also last work session with Ambassador Wolfgang Isching, who now heads the Munich Security Conference, and did a great job looking at the future of diplomacy and that resulting from the WikiLeaks debacle. And as Rafal chronicled this presentation, the prospect for waging war in cyberspace is a very real proposition for both small and large states. Building effective defenses will take time and extensive resources. And a cyber treaty may be a long way off, but international society should take concrete steps to curtail interstate aggression in cyberspace. And lastly, for the students, I've had the high privilege of meeting many of you during the symposium and learning about your outstanding scholarship. And I must also say, for our college students, you all are very conscientious and courteous drivers, some of the best I've had at a conference. And while I have your attention, I encourage those of you who seek a career, be it in business, law, or politics, to consider research topics that directly address the distribution and management of power in cyberspace. For you are the first net generation, and many of the distinguished organizations and institutions present here today will need your fresh and informed technical savvy perspective in order to make the most of cyberspace. So perhaps by the time of the next symposium, there will be some interesting dissertations and papers to read on this dynamic, important topic. So I thank you for your attention, and time remaining, we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we can have the lights on, and maybe we have time for just 2 questions. Who would like to? A lady there.
Hello, my name is Anna, and I study here at the University of St. Gallen. And thinking about WikiLeaks, Chaos Computer Club, Pirate Party, and also those groups who circumvent the restrictions of the internet, many or some people think of hackers as a new guard of political heroes. Could you comment on that?
Go for it. Well, certainly what they're indicative of is a new form of social agency that we haven't seen before, which operates and essentially colonizes cyberspace, not on a local level, but on a global level. It's important, I think, though, to separate movements which leverage technology as a means of communication from movements that actually target technology as a means of agency. So Chaos Club, for example, Anonymous, I would put in the latter category, whereas WikiLeaks, where really the fact that we had 250,000 documents leak out on the net was not so much a consequence of somebody hacking into a system as it was the fact that this distribution mechanism made it actually possible. I think certainly if we look at the way that events have unfolded during the color revolutions in the CIS and presently what we are starting to see in the Arab region, it's very clear that the net generation, the digital natives who have grown up with this technology all of their lives, have used it in ways which have allowed them to maneuver around social barriers or customary barriers to power, to mobilize essentially as forces. I think we're only starting to see the tip of the iceberg. Given the fact that the average age of most of these movements is between 18 and 25, we're really not seeing adults who have entered the fullness of their professional lives. So if I was to make a crystal ball prediction, I think we're going to see a lot more of this kind of mobilization going forward. At the same time, though, we're going to see a countervailing force to try to shut it down, regulate it, and control its possibilities.
Could we have the final question of the day? Gentleman there. Philip.
Thank you. I'm a little concerned that the term cyberspace conceals sometimes what we're actually talking about. So we certainly have seen a huge impact of social networks in, for example, the Arab Spring. And we also have certain scenarios of cybercrime that are becoming more and more popular. But aren't we lumping this all together by talking about cyberspace and colonizing cyberspace and risks and threats in cyberspace? Shouldn't we be more specific in talking about specific wanted and unwanted scenarios?
Sure. I think that's a fair point. It's easy to get lost in the jargon and the metaphors and the analogies. And cyberspace was, the history of the term. It was a Canadian science fiction author in 1984 in the book New Romancer that really introduced it in the popular lexicon. But now it really is the term that governments, industries, even militaries now are congregating around. So you make a very relevant point. I think Rafal, certainly the University of Toronto, is among the best in the world in amassing the hard data that really show where the incidents are and how to build proper defenses for them. But I think over time, all crime will be cybercrime potentially, and just as all warfare will, and in business as well. We've gone from mortar to clicks and mortar, and the future is very cyber-enabled. So as the digital natives come forth and mature, much of this will go into the background and become part of normal society.
I think it's also really important that we remain unfixed on one particular technology. So I could have used throughout most of my talk the term internet, but that would not have been accurate, because essentially what we're talking about is a series of technologies which have become increasingly converged. And they will continue to evolve. They'll take on different technical characteristics. But the fact that they continue to interoperate, both at a device level, infrastructure level, and also a global application level, I think is what distinguishes cyberspace from calling it a specific technology.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you give both these gentlemen a terrific hand?